Thursday, February 7th, having arrived. This is the Water Quality Management Committee meeting. We have in our group here today Kristen, who is the committee staff person. We have Jeff Gregg from GHD and Anastasia Rudenko from GHD. We have Paul Dreyer from the Planning Board. We have our tireless league observer and our tireless selectman, Doug Brown. So we may be joined by the town planner and possibly by the assistant town manager. And we will be joined later by the head of the Shellfish Advisory Committee when that piece comes up on the agenda. First thing on the agenda is a presentation by GHD on wastewater discharge options for Falmouth. As this is for our nationwide television audience, as our town fathers, mothers, and everybody knows, the current capacity for additional treated wastewater in the current locations that the town has is basically spoken for. And the town, if the town intends to ever do any additional sewering or even infill sewering beyond what's already projected, they're gonna have to have a new discharge site. A working group from this committee and the DPW and GHD have been costing out the different options and looking at the pros and the cons of the different options for the last year, I'd say.
Yeah.
And the result of their work is being rolled out today. This is the conclusion that gets reached. It won't be reached today, but when the conclusion gets reached by the selectmen as to which of these options the town wants to go forward with, that will be incorporated into the CWMP that will be delivered to the state at the end of 2019. But long before the end of 2019, the town fathers and mothers will have to make a conclusion as to what discharge site, if any, the town wants to proceed with. So with that, we'll have the presentation. We can do questions and answers during the presentation if you like, or we can wait till the end, whatever the committee would like.
Well, let's see how it unfolds. I mean, obviously, if you have a question for clarification, I think you should ask
Sure.
it.
Okay.
Wow.
Also joined by Amy Lowell, the town wastewater superintendent. And Anastasia, you're on.
Thank you very much, Eric. So I'm going to start today with an introduction to the project and then talk about the technologies that were considered as part of this project for effluent discharge. I'll next talk about the sites that were considered and the conceptual layouts that were developed for each site. And the last item that I'll touch on is the conceptual cost estimates and next steps for the project as a whole. So in 2014, a certificate was received for the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan and Final Environmental Impact Report and Targeted Watershed Management Plan for the Little Pond. The next part of the planning process is the development of a Notice of Project Change Update Report, which will be due at the end of the year in 2019. And the purpose of the report is to provide an update on the town's CWMP implementation efforts and the pilot demonstration non-traditional projects. As part of the next steps in planning, we're looking at additional wastewater flow from three main components. The first is what's called the Tetucket-Acapesket Sewer Study Area, which is portions of Green Pond and Great Pond watershed, and it's immediately east to the existing Little Pond sewer area. And for this presentation, it's being called TASA. The second portion is looking at redevelopment within the existing sewer system and what wastewater may be generated for that. So as part of this project, an allocation was reserved for that flow. That flow is going to be referred to as ESRA. And the third is looking at additional capacity for flow into the system from other developments. So each of these three components would require effluent disposal capacity, as Eric has just mentioned. This figure here shows the existing effluent discharge capacity at the wastewater treatment facility, which is located on Route 28 and Blacksmith Shop Road. So the facility here and open sand beds 1 to 13, and then to the north 14 and 15, which were constructed for discharge of flow from the Little Pond service area. This map here shows the conceptual layout of the different effluent disposal sites. So for each of these conceptual layouts, water would be collected and conveyed to the existing wastewater treatment plant on Blacksmith Shop Road, treated there, and then would be pumped to each of the different locations. So I'll touch upon these in more detail in a few minutes, but just as a general overview, the different options that were looked at is a regional solution, so a new treated water force main to Joint Base Cape Cod to the existing wastewater treatment facility. Two different options to utilize the existing sand beds at the wastewater treatment facility. Two options for an ocean outfall, so one is in Buzzards Bay, and the second down at Nopska Point, and three additional land-based solutions. So one at the Alain Parcel, which is off of Sandwich Road and Carriage Shop Road, and then at the Falmouth Country Club, a little bit further down Carriage Shop Road, and the Augusta Parcel off of Route 28. There were a number of technologies that were considered, including open sand beds, spray irrigation, leaching facilities, drip dispersal, well injection, and wick wells, and then two locations for a potential ocean outfall at Buzzards Bay and Nopska Point. And this figure here just shows the open sand beds at the treatment plant, 14 and 15. As a result of the screening, three types of technologies were recommended for the conceptual layout. The first was open sand beds. It was recommended because it has a relatively high hydraulic loading capacity, which means it needs less land area than a lot of the other options that were considered. And it also has less maintenance requirements because most of the infrastructure is above ground and can be easily accessed. The third thing about this technology is it is something that the town is familiar with because there are open sand beds at the facility. The second type of technology is subsurface leaching facilities, and this is looked at for places where there's a secondary use for the property. For instance, a golf course or a ballpark or a public park, where you can bury the infrastructure underground and maintain the primary use of the site. And the third was ocean outfalls, which have a relatively small land area, a relatively high disposal capacity, and the ability to discharge outside of a nutrient-impacted watershed. So this again are the open sand beds at the wastewater treatment facility. They're located in two different watersheds. So sand beds 1 through 13 are in the West Falmouth Harbor watershed, and 14 or 15 are outside. The treatment facility currently operates under a groundwater discharge permit that was given in 2015, and it allocates flow by watershed. As I mentioned, open sand beds 1 through 13 are in the West Falmouth Harbor watershed, and the permit has a load limit, a nitrogen load limit for those sand beds. That load limit is made up of two components. One is the amount of flow that goes to sand beds, and the second is the concentration of nitrogen in an inverse relationship. So theoretically, if you can lower the effluent nitrogen, you could put more flow into those sand beds. The facility is currently designed to treat through 3 milligrams per liter of total nitrogen, which is a very low total nitrogen limit. And in order to go even lower, you would likely need to go to a membrane technology. A membrane technology produces a reject stream, which in this location, there are no really practical treatment or recharge options. It's a very nutrient-heavy stream. So because there were no practical options for this, this option was not considered any further. The second option that was looked at the facility is expanding existing open sand beds 14 and 15. These sand beds were originally designed to recharge flow from the Little Pond service area, and the original extent of the bed, the northern extent, is this gray line right here. There is potential on the site to expand them to the north, and under this conceptual layout, we would be able to reuse the infrastructure used to convey the treated wastewater to the site, and then to gain capacity by pushing that border to the north. So So for each of the options that I'm going to talk about, I'll talk about the conceptual capital costs for the project, and then the amount of capacity for that site in 3 components. So the first is, can it take the flow from TASA? And the second is, can it take the flow from TASA and then also for the redevelopment allocation for the existing service area? And the third is whether there's additional land area that could be developed in the future for future effluent disposal capacity. So for the sand beds 14 and 50, if they were to be expanded, the conceptual capital costs for the project are $1.9 million. And with that expansion, it's anticipated there would be capacity for TASA. There is potential, so the design loading rate is based on the design hydraulic loading rate of the facility. There is potential to do testing and to see if a higher loading rate is appropriate for the site. When the site was being designed, they were very favorable percolation rates, and the beds have been performing very well since they've been constructed. If that testing is done and a higher loading rate is sought, there's potentially room for both TASA and for the redevelopment allocation. However, with those 2 allocations, you would be maxing out the capacity of the site, and there isn't future capacity. The next parcel that was looked at is the Alain Parcel. So this is off of Sandwich Road and Carrot Shop Road. It's a 70-acre parcel, and 14 acres in the southwest corner have been designated for general municipal use. So a conceptual layout was designed for open sand beds, and it was sized to treat the flow both from TASA and from the redevelopment allocation. So this conceptual layout shows is the new effluent treated force main to the site, and then the 4 beds. And this pink line here is the 14-acre parcel that's designated for general municipal use. So as you can see, there is area that could be developed in the future for future discharge capacity. And those 14 acres are within the Great Pond watershed. There was initially subsurface investigations that were done in 2010. They showed very favorable percolation rates for effluent discharge. As part of this project in 2018, additional testing was done, which confirmed the percolation rates and established a design loading rate of 7 gallons per day per square foot for open sand beds. One thing that I wanted to note is during those subsurface investigations in 2018, there was a shallow layer of unsuitable material that was found that would have to be excavated if this site was developed. For the conceptual layout, the capital costs are $12.7 million, and this would give you capacity for TASA, for Ezra, and then additional capacity in the future that could be developed. And in a layout like this, the force main would be sized to be able to take both the TASA and Ezra, and then also into the future for the full potential of the site.
Does this include the costs of the pipe to get it there?
Yes, so all of these costs include, there's an effluent lift station at the treatment facility that's needed to pump the flow, the force main, and then the infrastructure at the site itself. Those are the 3 components. The third land site that was looked at is the Falmouth Country Club. This is comprised of multiple town parcels that equals about 150 acres. For this project, we focused on the portion of the property that's within the Green Pond watershed. So that's the portion of the property that's bounded by this blue line here and this blue line here. So this is an example of a site where you want to maintain the primary use of the property. You want to be able to still use the golf courses. So a conceptual layout was developed for subsurface leaching fields. And again, this was sized for TASA and for Ezra. And there are additional fairways that could be developed in the future in the site for additional capacity, as well as other locations on the country club property as a whole that could be developed. Hydraulic load testing was done on this property in 2010. which also indicated favorable percolation conditions. Because this is subsurface leaching, so I'd spoken previously that you have a much higher hydraulic loading capacity for open sand beds, which was 7 gallons per day per square foot. And as you can see for subsurface, it's a much lower value at 3 gallons per day per square foot. The conceptual capital costs are $15.4 million, and that would cover TASA and Ezra. And then you have the capacity for future development also, for recharge capacity. The Augusta parcel is located on Route 28, immediately to the west of Falmouth Lumber. And it's also a town-owned parcel. It's approximately 20 acres, and it's in the Great Pond watershed. As part of this project, we conducted hydraulic load testing, which showed favorable soil conditions. However, there is a deed restriction on the property that limits the amount of discharge that can be developed on the property. Because of that deed restriction, it was decided that this should be considered as a future booster lift station location. So that booster lift station would be from TASA, conveying the flow to the wastewater treatment facility. This figure shows Joint Base Cape Cod. So this green is the Falmouth wastewater treatment facility. And in this layout, a new treated force main would be constructed that would tie into the existing Joint Base Cape Cod collection system, which would eventually recharge up near the canal. Joint Base Cape Cod has an existing wastewater treatment facility that's currently owned by the Air Force and operated and maintained by the Air National Guard. And it has a current discharge near Cape Cod Canal. In 2017, Wright Peers conducted a study of shared wastewater management options for the facility between Bourne, Falmouth, Mashpee, and Sandwich. So the study looked at how much flow could be sent from those 4 communities to an upgraded facility at Joint Base Cape Cod. In order for this option to go forward, an agreement would need to be developed between Joint Base Cape Cod and the participating towns. So at this point, this is being considered as a long-term effluent disposal option. Capital costs, which were derived from the Wright Peers study, indicate that this option is approximately $44.4 million. And it would have capacity for TASA and Ezra, and then also for future capacity.
And the watershed that it would discharge into depends on where you go on the site, I assume?
So the existing recharge goes to the Cape Cod Canal.
Right.
So outside of Falmouth's watersheds.
Steve, go ahead.
Clarify.
Oh, of course,
When you gave these costs for these various options,
yes.
some of them just do TASA, some do TASA plus extra, and some have additional capacity. Is the cost for it fully built out to do all of those things, or is it for some standardized amount?
The cost is for TASA and Ezra if it can handle it,
But not the extra?
not the extra. So that would be developed in the future.
Okay. Thank you.
Ocean outfalls in Massachusetts are governed by the Ocean Sanctuaries Act. Historically, they were prohibited from about the 70s until 2014, when the legislation was revised. And it now outlines prerequisites for new and modified discharges to ocean sanctuaries. Because of the revision, this is now being considered as a future long-term effluent discharge solution for Falmouth. This is a conceptual layout that was developed for a potential ocean outfall in Buzzards Bay. So again, this green is the facility, and this shows a new effluent lift station, a treated water force main, and then an ocean outfall extending into Buzzards Bay, approximately 4,380 linear feet. And that length was determined with high-resolution ocean model data and a plume tracking model that was used to determine both the optimal length of the infrastructure and then also where it sits. So right now it sits in the deepest part of that shoreline in order to promote the dispersion. For cost, oh, sorry, go ahead.
The 4 million gallons per day, is that an annual per day average, or is that
Yes.
seasonal high?
It's an annual average.
Okay,
So
so
the-
summer's gonna be,
The maximum month is 7 million gallons per
yeah,
day, yes.
okay, that's,
Yeah,
okay, I wanted to,
yeah. And so the pipe is sized to handle both of those conditions,
Oh.
yes.
okay, cause I see the 3 million gallons per day plugged in.
Yes,
Down there,
this
which
is,
would
this
hit
is the
this.
average. This is the average, but it would also have the capacity for
Yeah.
the maximum month and for peak conditions.
Question?
Yes,
So for this one, TASA plus ESRA cost you 70 million, but then the extra's free, because you'd be crazy not to build it to size, to handle the whole
yes.
thing.
So
right?
for each of these options, the force main is sized to handle the potential long-term flow. The difference in the land-based options is you wouldn't build the disposal capacity.
Right, but
However, for this, since you're sizing the pipe anyways, that would be included in this cost, and the diffusers, which is the other component of this infrastructure, would also be the same size. So you're right, it's not a complete apples to apples, but it's just because of the way the infrastructure is constructed. And there's two primary ways that an ocean outfall can be constructed. One is an open trench installation, so you're cutting a trench, putting your pipe in, backfilling the trench. The second is called horizontal directional drilling, and it's a subsurface method where you're not actually breaking the surface of the ocean floor, except for where you come out. This can be a more cost-effective solution. However, there's a lot of field investigation that needs to be done to characterize what you're drilling through and whether this is an appropriate technology. The cost estimates were developed for horizontal directional drilling, the 70 million that's shown here. However, the additional field investigations would be needed, and if a larger portion was needed to be installed with open cut trenching, these costs are anticipated to increase. And as I mentioned before, this is a long-term solution, so it's a much higher flow rate that would be conveyed, the 4 million gallons per day, as opposed to the land-based treatment options. The second ocean outfall location that was evaluated as part of this study is off of Nopska Point, approximately 2,000 linear feet, down in Woods Hole. This is an option that was originally evaluated in the 1970s as part of wastewater planning efforts, and conceptual costs were developed during the CWMP process in 2011. As part of this process, the costs were evaluated to bring them up to today's dollars and also to assess the effect of being able to potentially install using horizontal directional drilling. So again, these costs are for horizontal directional drilling, but you would need field investigations to be able to determine if it could be installed through this method. And this also is sized for average annual flow of 4 million gallons per day as a long-term solution. This slide here shows a summary of all the costs that I've talked about. The first line is the anticipated construction costs, and then the allowances that are added in order to calculate the overall capital cost of the project in 2018 dollars. And they're bookended by, the lowest cost option is expanding the open sand beds 14 and 15. And then at the highest end are the two ocean outfall solutions. For next steps of the project, for the effluent disposal portion, the next step is to develop the effluent discharge site that'll be described in the Notice of Project Change report. And the factors to consider in this decision are the capacity of the site, both for the next phase of the project and for the future, capital and operating costs, environmental impact, and neighborhood impact. And overall, for the next step of the projects, the next topics that will be discussed at this meeting are the conceptual T-ticket Acapesket study area and the plant upgrades that are required to be able to treat the flow from TASA and from Ezra. And with that, I would like to open it up to any questions.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the committee, and then questions or comments from everyone else.
Anastasia, when they do the subsurface, I assume that's when they're calling drip, or the subsurface,
They're leaching
Leach.
trenches,
and how deep below grade are they?
about 3 or 4 feet. They're fairly shallow.
I'm just wondering if you have to, I mean, I know the capacity is only 50% per square foot of the open sand beds, but if you're going to have to dig up the Allen parcel and thinking really long-term, we always need recreational land in Falmouth. If you dug up twice the space to get it back to the site capacity that you would have with the original thing, would it make sense to dig up the whole thing, since you've got to dig it up to remove this unsuitable layer? I don't know how deep down that is.
So
just
that,
throwing that out just
that
off the top of
unsuitable
my-
layer was within the first few feet.
Yeah.
So it's something that would be excavated
Right.
anyways during the development of the site.
So it's on the order of the depth that you would
Yes.
excavate
Yes.
for the pipe work, piping, yeah.
Well, but at this point, we don't know the extent of the unsuitable layer because the previous percolation test that was done in 2010 was also in the same vicinity of the beds, and that did not show this layer. So so you got yes one and no the other. So until you actually look at the
Sure.
specific site where beds 1 through 4 would go, we can't say whether there really is a lot or not.
I won't, yeah.
So that just
Yeah,
to
I'm
put
just sort of
that,
free associating right now, looking at these options.
Yeah.
and thinking,
Right. Matt?
I have a couple of questions about the comparison chart that you have there on the previous slide, and whether or not you're able to look at like cost per million gallons per day treated, and also eventually we'll want to consider operation and maintenance costs of these different efforts, and maybe
Yes.
that's way in the future, but
It
just
is, but
curious.
I can calculate those costs and bring them to a future meeting.
And in the case of the ocean outfall example, you know, one potential operations and maintenance cost would be all of the monitoring that presumably, you know, folks would want to see in order for that to be permitted. I'm thinking about the Boston Harbor outfall and all of the water quality monitoring, and that continues to this day and will
Yes.
continue on into the future.
I can comment on that just a little bit. I think from the experience of the Boston outfall, we know that after that went into effect, 2005? We've seen no environmental impact. So I think the monitoring agencies, as we begin to look at outfalls in the future, are not going to have that restrictive a monitoring process. But could I just go back to talking about that Allen parcel a minute?
Yes.
So one of the, if you think of the Allen parcel or the golf course is really nothing but a standard soil absorption system that we're all familiar with in our own backyards. Has 3 feet of cover, and they have a failure rate of about every 20 years they're going to fail. So if we were to do that on the Allen parcel, we could anticipate that in 20 years, we'd have to dig it all up again and replace suitable soils. Whereas if you have an open trench, an open bed, the way we've been using, they're very easy to go in and service and rejuvenate. So I think to think about the advantage of a ballpark would not.
Yeah, no, I was just doing a little, outside the sand bed thinking. But also, I hope the town, thanks to Amy, is gonna deliver a much higher quality product to these beds than we get in a typical residential leach field. I hope, Amy, I hope you're nodding your head when I say that. Good.
Right. Any other comments or questions? Steve?
I liked all those comments, and they have one thing in common. They all want to see a complete life cycle cost.
Mhm.
And I think we should get that as soon as possible before thinking much
Yep.
more about it.
just so I'm clear, life cycle cost for TASA plus ESRA? Or,
Well, that's another big thing that
Just-
you need, is the next obvious question is, and somebody alluded to it, the cost per million gallons and how many more million gallons. And what is the ultimate need that the town's gonna have for everything?
right, I agree with you, and that's why I'm asking you to clarify that. Obviously, what's directly in front of us is TASA plus Ezra, but I think we need to think about future capacity at the same time. And I think that's a significant factor that we should do a very thorough discussion on.
Ron?
Yeah, I have a little short presentation. Can follow up on Selectman Brown's request concerning ocean outfall. I did a little follow-up because of particularly his interest in that. Also, I was wondering, the sites or beds 14 and 15, the expansion that is suggested for that area. There are a couple of things. One is that it was interesting, and maybe Amy can follow up on this. I reread the discharge permit at midnight. But I mean, we have so much, like 1,000 gallon capacity to be discharged there, and that's the limit. But what was interesting about that site, as compared to the other beds, is that there's no nitrogen limit in discharge on the permit as it stands. That may change. But, so it's interesting that the expansion there may be feasible, because I don't know, I had understood that the nitrogen load from that site was a concern, but there's nothing in the permit as it stands now. And secondly, there is the phosphorus issue that's being monitored now. And we don't know what's gonna happen with that yet. There's, some expert views are it won't be a problem. Other expert views are it's very risky and it probably will be a problem. So, so we don't know about that. It's a nice price tag, but it relatively speaking, in some ways. But there's some outstanding things. But is that correct? There is no nitrogen limit, or is that?
Yeah,
this
maybe
is not
Amy
in the
could address
permit.
that, and then we'll, go ahead.
Amy Lowell, the wastewater superintendent. So you're right that there is not a nitrogen load limit in the permit for beds 14 and 15.
Right.
But there is a nitrogen concentration limit of 10, and the same concentration limit and target apply to beds 14 and 15 as apply to the rest of them. And really, if you multiply out the target by the gallons per day number, it's an implied load target as well. So there is definitely a concern for nitrogen discharge in that area, but there is not a specific load limit assigned in the permit. There is a concentration limit of 10 and a concentration target of 3.
So if the volume is increased and you stay under 10, assuming, I don't know why in a way there may be, is there an implied limit then? Based on
So
the
there is
flow and
the same concentration limits for nitrogen apply across the board for all of our discharge. And in our permit specifically multiplies that out for West Falmouth Harbor watershed and says that our target for nitrogen load to West Falmouth Harbor is 3 times the 450,000 gallons per day. It does not lay that out specifically for beds 14 and 15, but certainly there is an intention within the permit to limit nitrogen north of the West Falmouth Harbor watershed boundary as well.
All right, well, now, you had a presentation of which we were not aware of, so I think what we'll do is take comments and questions from the rest of the audience on GHD's presentation, and when people have finished with that, we will see what you have.
I wanted to make another comment on beds 14 and 15, if you could flip back to, I'd like you to flip back to the one that shows, yes, if you go back to the slide that shows all of the beds and the aerial, okay. All right, so we know that we have very strict limits for beds 1 through 13, and that's because they're within the West Falmouth watershed. And then there is a watershed boundary line somewhere north of 1 through 13, but south of 14 and 15. But we're very close to that boundary. And so the permitting for 14 and 15 is going to have a lot of issues to look at because it's so close to that boundary. It's done by modeling, and we knew that based on the flow for 14 and 15 presently, we're where we ought to be. We're in the next watershed. And that watershed discharges directly to Buzzards Bay. It does not discharge to any impaired estuary. But we're now talking about adding to that, so there will have to be remodeling done. That's my first point. The second point is that we know at the time that we permitted 14 and 15 that there was considerable concern from the residents that are downstream in Crocker Pond, and Crocker Pond shows on that map. And so as this first conversation occurs today, this is going to become part of a larger community conversation as various neighborhoods look at what has been put out on the table. So we need to recognize that there will be, again, questions from the Crocker Pond area neighborhood about both nitrogen and phosphorus. My concern is that that particular site won't take into, won't be able to accommodate anything in the future, and to me, that's a significant factor.
Doug. Selectman Brown.
Hello. Hi, Doug Brown. So I have a question about the country club. The 15 million, does that include putting the course back together as well?
Yes, there is a restoration. That's okay. Yeah, restoration of the fairways and the golf course is included.
And I'm curious why you would choose the golf course itself rather than the adjacent parcel, which is just wooded. Maybe we could clear an area there and put an extra recreation field in. Was that given any consideration?
Is the parcel that you're referring to shown on this figure here, or is it in a different part of?
You would need to go back to your original over slide. Your total, it's way back at the beginning,
Way back.
your first overview.
Oh,
There
here
you go,
we
yeah.
Here we go.
So you see in blue.
Yes.
Okay. So the existing beds are, I'm sorry, as conceptually presented, they're in the Green Pond watershed. The water, the effluent that's being treated is coming from the Great Pond and Green Pond watersheds, and that's going to be a subsequent presentation. So the thought was keeping it close to the watershed that it came from. If you move farther east, you then get into the Bournes Pond watershed. So you are moving water from, quote, one watershed to another. Bournes Pond watershed has the potential not to need any sewering if we do the inlet widening and the shellfish and some IAs. There will be a new added load if you discharge within the Bournes watershed because the state counts every molecule. So we're discharging at 3 milligrams per liter, so they're going to calculate there's a new load to the Bournes Pond watershed of this amount, which may trip you over into needing to sewer the Bournes Pond watershed. It's a factor to be considered. It's not to say that you couldn't move over to the east to that wooded parcel, I think it was called the Degnan parcel, that you can't do that, but it does trigger other things.
Any other comments? Good. All right, the planning board.
Full dry at town meeting on precinct 2. I noticed that the two Outfall options are about 5 times more expensive than the found options. What's the make of that cost estimate? What's the big element in there? Because the Outfall from Pleasant Bay is about 4,300 feet. One to Knobsky is 2,000. So where are the big ticket items in those two numbers?
Construction in the ocean. Construction in the ocean. So whether you do open cut or whether you do horizontal drilling, the majority of the cost is the actual outfall from the shoreline to the endpoint of the pipe. It's a very expensive process.
Okay, second question I made. The town is considering placing the sewer force main under the bike paths. Goes from Woods Hole all the way up to the treatment plant. Is there any consideration of putting a small packet treatment plant in Woods Hole and take that flow and put it into Knobsky rather than pump it all the way up to the treatment plant and then pumping it back down to an outflow?
So when the NAPSCA concept was originally developed, there was there was consideration of a treatment facility down in Woods Hole.
A
Steve?
related question. Why is the Knobsco one less expensive? It seems it's much further from the plant, and there are more rocks to go through.
Because of it's a smaller component, so you're drilling, or you're going 2,000 feet into the ocean as opposed to 4,380.
Oh, the underwater component
underwater
swamps
portion,
the
yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
land component.
So even though the force main is much longer than the Buzzards Bay option, that's the primary driver, is the
And
length
on-
under the
And on the
ocean.
Buzzards Bay one, you can see it here, but you have an exploded view of it somewhere else.
Find it quickly.
Yeah, I just went past it. Is there no road to permit you to do the obvious reduction in length?
Could potentially. We did look at this option. Overall, it's a fairly small cost in the project. So at this point, we went with the more conservative length. This is the old blacksmith shop road. It's a very narrow road, so it may be hard to do construction in that road, but that definitely is an option that would be considered in final design.
All right, Ron?
Yeah, has this Buzzards Bay option been discussed with the Buzzards Bay Coalition?
None of these options have been discussed with anybody until they came to this committee. It's been part
Okay,
of the
well-
working group.
Okay, so,
I might comment on that. The Buzzards Bay Coalition with Buzzards Bay, the town of Wareham, are proposing a 10 million gallon outfall at the Mass Maritime Academy. They are in the process of pre-permitting that. So the coalition is pushing that outfall option very hard. They think that is the best option for those communities around Buzzards Bay and Wareham to deal with their discharge. And so they are on board with that, and their board is very aggressively going to push that and push the public acceptance of that.
Good. Comments, questions from the rest of the committee, from Doug?
I have another question about the Mass Military Reservation option.
Yes.
So that would assume that we would still treat the effluent, and it would be just piped there just for discharge, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any consideration that we should potentially pipe directly out there for treatment as well as discharge?
As part of the Wright Pierce evaluation, there were 3 different options that were considered: a short-term option, a mid-term option, and a long-term option. In the long-term option, there is a small portion of flow and septage that is taken to Joint Base Cape Cod. But in the mid-term option, everything is treated at the treatment plant in Falmouth.
As Ray will tell you, we have plenty of capacity for treatment at the plant now. And so building, sending some of it off far away to be treated there right now doesn't make any sense. Maybe, the time may come.
I would add to that, Ray has said that Joint Base Cape Cod should be considered a long-term option, but not a short-term option. And I think it's partly because we already have the capacity. It's also that to get to the point where it would become a reality, there is an enormous amount of bureaucracy that has to be worked through as well, and a district set up. The plant itself needs upgrades, so it's not just, we can send it out there and forget about it. You tie into a lot of other issues. I know that the town manager is working with the other abutting towns, and they are looking at that. But it is a very complicated picture.
And not to complicate it further, but one of the, if we're talking about annual costs, there's an estimate in that Wright Pierce report about annual costs of about $440,000 a year to be paid to whatever entity is operating the thing out there to take our treated wastewater. Okay, any other comments or questions? This is the beginning of a conversation the town is going to have for the next 6 months on these options, and by the end of the year, the town fathers will have picked one, fathers and mothers, and put it into our report to the state of what we're gonna do, and at that point, we're kinda locked into it, so
Yeah.
this is the year. None of this stuff is gonna be built this year or next year, but this is the year when we have to make a choice of where we wanna go with this.
Eric?
Okay.
You made me think of something. Since what you just said is obviously true, and since these numbers, the capital costs, are so different, I just want to emphasize that we can't make a meaningful decision without knowing the long-term future needs. That's everything. I mean, they can all do TESA, and maybe even the cheapest one can also do ESRA. And they're differing by more than a factor of 10 in costs, so it depends on the marginal extra stuff.
Absolutely.
Right.
Ron, do you have something for us?
I've got something, thanks, Eric. So I would have, let me get up there.
It's customary to send it around a couple of days before so that we can comply with the open meeting law. But in this case, unless there's an objection from one of the members, I guess we can let Ron do this. Hearing no objection.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. I was gonna make this very simple, and then it started, as you start the ball of twine starting to get bigger and bigger and more complicated. So I'm sorry, it just sort of came up that way. And so I started to look at, the ocean outfall option a little bit more, and then thought about it in terms of a regional approach. And instead of our thinking, as we have been, about shipping our wastewater out, it may be that we would do a regional approach, and Falmouth might possibly become a hub using our existing facility and drawing the wastewater even from Mashpee or Bourne or others, depending on how it comes out economically. If you've noticed, there is another regional program going on in the Lower Cape with Dennis, Harwich, Yarmouth, and Barnstable collaborating on doing a wastewater treatment thing. And we have a plant, we have a place, we have things set up in these other towns, don't so much, outside of Joint Base Cape Cod, which I hadn't factored into it. But just to come quickly to the Mashpee example, that's some of the data that I did have. And in Mashpee, their first thrust has been on shellfish aquaculture, and with that, to try and save $140 million in sewer costs. But in addition, so we still have $220 million of sewering, okay? It isn't like that's gonna go away. And there is a wastewater flow, but with the aquaculture, they came up with some numbers that were essentially considered reasonable by DEP, and it's in their final plan to go ahead with this. But when we look at the budgeting that has been done by GHD, thank you very much, the budgeting that was done is sort of indicated here, and I've sort of highlighted some elements. The treatment systems are listed here. We would still have to have a treatment system, but even an expansion, if it were to come to Falmouth. The one thing about Falmouth, though, is that we're basically, and Steve raised the right question there, is that what does the future look like? And right now, we had a $600 million project, $800 million project that was considered unreasonable, and therefore we thought to look at alternatives. Well, so far, the one alternative that we've come up with that's really being moved ahead with is inlet widening. That's gonna save about 10 million of that 600 million. And that's about what we have. We have shellfish as something, but it's not really being done in a real concerted fashion just yet. But when you start looking at these numbers and sorting out the difference, like the recharge, there's, in Mashpee, they wouldn't need a recharge facility. Okay, they could, and then there's this other recharge facility that somehow is associated with other towns.
Question, why would they not need a recharge?
Oh, no, if they shipped it to us.
Oh, what a
That's
good
what I mean,
idea.
as an alternative, okay? I don't know what the cost would be there, but in looking at this, we're starting to see, this is, kicking out a new idea, Eric. I'm sorry to startle you with something like this, but I did send around some information that should have alluded to these ideas. Anyway, in looking at this, we have the recharge facilities basically in the Mashpee plant of like, costing 5.7 to 15 million. Now, that would be, that could be diverted to a pipe. Now, the pipe cost would be additional to bringing it here, but there could be an economy of scale of having one central hub type of a plant. And so and that's where the treatment facilities costs in Mashpee, for example, could be possibly reduced or even eliminated if it came here. It just depends on how it goes. So when you look at the outfall costs, they may be high, but if we were able to have the volume that that would be required to justify it from a cost-effective viewpoint, it could be looked at. Now, there are the costs of transporting, but as you said, the main cost with outflow has been outfall has been the marine part of it, the submarine part. So I think that we're starting to look at these factors and to try and think about this and again, stepping out of the box a bit and not looking at everything in the traditional manner. So if Falmouth were to become the hub, where would all the effluent go? And this is where it comes down to the discharge. Now, what's interesting is that I found this, I had this report from Hui from the early 1970s, and I just passed that around. And they went through, and it was interesting, they estimated 3.7 million gallons from the East Falmouth need, 3.7 million. Well, Stearns and Wheeler came up with the calculation in 2007 of 3.6 million. So whoever did the calculations back in 1970, when things were quite different here, as I recall, it wasn't too far off. But they also used a discharge concentration of 40 milligrams per liter of nitrogen. Now we're doing 3 milligrams per liter. So we're already got like a 13.3 better deal going on here with what the state of the art of today's ability and the town's lead. So when you get into that, and then the phosphorus, they use 10 milligrams per liter, and we're doing 2.5 on average. So we now have a quarter of that. Now phosphorus is usually not a big deal in the ocean. It's not a limiting factor. It is the nitrogen, which is the limiting factor. So then you go through it, and then you come to and then you've got a net flow. They looked at the flow, the back and forth currents in Vineyard Sound. They came up with it at that point about over 50 billion gallon per day net flow out, and so that's a huge amount. So if you move on through this analysis here, back of the envelope effort, we find that instead of, we're basically can do like 13.3 times more than 3.7 million gallons per day, or 50 million gallons per day at the same nitrogen loading as was estimated in the 1970s. 50 million, now that's a lot. Okay, that's more than we could imagine, but let's say we're at 3.6, let's say Falmouth altogether is 5. Now, it looks like we are marching ahead with the sewers, so that's happening, and the alternatives are not that clear. Even IA systems, we still have to deal with the septage. There's a septage pumping that has to come out of there. That's the usual thing, so that's another element to it. So there is a high cost for an OPSCA outfall, but it may very well prove to be effective. Now, there are, of course, issues, and we all know a lot of these. Okay, one is social acceptance of putting a pipe out in the ocean, but John just said they're doing it in Buzzards Bay, right next door practically. So maybe that would be still an issue. That would have to be discussed and understood among in the community. Then the coordination. Unfortunately, we have two great politicians on our committee. A great history. They know the business of talking and getting things done. People understand concepts. So we've got two great politicians, and they are
you and me?
Yeah, well, the chair and co-chair are our leaders, and they can handle this. But basically coordinating with Mashpee, with even I don't know about Sandwich, but Even joint, I doubt joint base Cape Cod, but maybe Bourne, there's something, there could be a volume. There is a significant, like what I found was about an additional 1.5 million gallons from Mashpee, possibly 2 million gallons from Mashpee possibly coming or whatever. But then we get into the other dimension of this, which even applies to the groundwater discharge that we're talking about, and that's other contaminants, and how those would be dealt with. Because if they could be dealt with at the plant, it's centralized. And one other thing to look at about IAs. In the South Coast project area, the current, or basically the number of properties that could be built out to is over 1,800. Now, I can't imagine 1,800 IA systems, or even a third of those as being IA systems, possibly being managed individually by households in those areas. So IA is going to have a role, but how much of a role? It seems to me that what we know today, Mashpee's going a different route with their aquaculture. Falmouth isn't, or hasn't. We've done a bit, but not really seriously. So it is, it looks like that this might be, you know, a possibility of looking into. Now, whether it takes money, we do have $25,000 to think about. But
right.
basically,
Okay, let's stick to the
I'm just
topic here.
trying to, well, this is part of, but this is another option. But the thing is that I think that this needs to be looked at quantitatively, do some, you know, put some feelers out, get a sense.
Yeah.
Because all the towns, I don't know how much is in Bourne. I know Mashpee's got all kinds of issues. They're hoping for the aquaculture, and it looks like conservatively it should work out, but it just depends on where that's going. But we are right now have a situation, and it could be that following the Lower Capes example, we might think about a regional approach, and possibly we could be the hub. And we would, and as Eric just said, $444,000 to ship it out. Well, it's $444,000 to ship it in, and that comes to our coffers, or whatever it might be. There are going to be associated costs that would have to be worked out. There's an economic dimension. But I think basically that this is something that I would encourage folks to look at.
Thank you, John.
Thank
Comments or questions from the committee?
I have several comments.
Yes.
First of all, Ron, I always appreciate your thoughts because they're so wide-ranging. So I'm just saying that you've said a lot of things today that I, you know, am sort of
You have to absorb.
absorb, yes. I do want to say first that although the Mashpee Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan put an enormous amount of emphasis on aquaculture, they're really working on a parallel path, just the way the town of Falmouth is. We're looking at sewering where it needs to be, and we are looking at alternatives where we can do them. We just received the Mashpee Board of Sewer Commissioners agenda for February 7th, and on that is a contract with GHD for $450,000, preliminary design of municipal wastewater treatment plant adjacent to the transfer station has been approved and signed. So that's something that, you know, we may not have been aware of, but it's, that community, just like our community, is looking at a variety of things, and they're trying to do a very, you know, professional and careful job on all of them. So it's not just aquaculture. So that's my first point. The second is that Ray Jack has never talked about making our plant regional. I would totally have to defer to him as to what he thinks about that. And the more the more flow there is into the plant, the larger the discharge question becomes. So we should, at this point, stay focused. We need to figure out discharge. Just looking at our own long-term will pose a big enough question, let alone adding additional flow.
Okay, well, this is not going to be a debate. Any other comments or questions from anyone else here? Doug?
Hi, Doug Brown again. So I believe our treatment capacity is 1.2 million And I
1.2.
think I was told that the plant is expandable, but is that correct?
Yes.
But
Yes.
is there some projected limit on the capacity
No.
for treatment?
It's always been described as 1.2, design right now for 1.2, expandable to 1.4. Certainly, there's land area there to add modular units adjacent to what we have to expand beyond what we have there now.
Okay, any other,
Could I comment?
Steve.
I'd like to
Yeah,
comment a
John.
little bit about the outfall. This is something that I've been working on for almost 20 years, to get that Ocean Sanctuaries Act changed so that this would become an option for us. If we look at the cost initially, it's pretty much of a shocker that we're talking about $60 million to do that. I look at that in a similar way that we did with our new water treatment plant. We, with that water treatment plant, went for the 100-year solution. I think of the outfall as Falmouth's 100-year solution. Do we really want to set ourselves up with something that will take us for the next 100 years? And I think that's something that we should think about seriously. There's been some concern about, do we need a 4 million gallon outfall? Again, in putting that in, the size of the pipe is not what's going to drive the cost of that project. And our sister town of Dartmouth, which has a population of 35,000, very similar to ours, has an outfall pipe of 4.2 million gallons a day. So very comparable situation. But I just think, as we're thinking about this, do we want to keep thinking about upland discharge into parcels of land which we value, which will ultimately impact the coastline, or do we want to consider the long-term solution which would solve this problem for the next 100 years? And I'll just leave it there.
I agree that we don't have time for a debate now, but I think we should have the debate. Somebody should come up with the numbers to either say, and it might be the numbers that Doug just elicited from Amy, that there's no way it works with the capacity of the plant, or the numbers, or some other reason, the numbers might be that, whoa, maybe Ron has a point here, but somebody should look into that.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to the next item on the agenda here, which is of extreme uninterest to almost everybody else. But the committee will now discuss and vote on SMAS final report, quote, Pond Watch nutrient-related water quality, Bowens Pond, Green Pond, Great Pond, Little Pond, Oyster Pond, West Falmouth Harbor, SMAS post-MEP sampling assessment. That's the first page.
Right. We all saw this back in October. There were comments made by various members. They were consolidated by Kristen and myself and sent to SMAS. And he made some modifications and has provided us with the final report. We have what we need. We have the data, and we have the report, and we have the proof to the state that all these estuaries have been monitored and continue to be monitored. Up until now, this has been covered by grants. Going forward, it will now be covered within the wastewater budget, thanks to cooperation and help from the DPW. And so I'll move that we approve this report and get it filed.
Can I get a second?
I'll second.
Moved and seconded, discussion?
I just have, I just have a point. I'm sorry, Eric.
Go.
You always look at that kind of scowl when you look at me, but thanks. I just wanted to point out that I was looking through all the tables and everything once again, and like in 2014, there's a real dip across the board in chlorophyll. So what happened? Otherwise, it's creeping along. So then I went into the weather report, and what I recall back in 2014 was a summer where I did a lot more bailing of my boat than sailing. And the average rainfall for June, July, August, and September is like .025 inches. I don't know if that seems very low, but that's from Joint Base Cape Cod data, or the Coast Guard station. That summer, the average was .74. 0.025 to .74 was like 30 times higher. So I assume it was much more overcast through the summer of 2014, and therefore the plankton would not have had a chance to bloom as much because there just wasn't enough photons coming in there to get them going. So it hit me, and I was just trying to figure out why, but it's all the way, every one of the estuaries is the same thing, and it's just like, there it is. It looks like it could just have been sunshine, shading, darkness.
Fair enough.
Okay,
Tom?
thanks.
Yeah, as the concern I expressed before, if we vote to accept this, are we endorsing the conclusions and the call for action? So I see Virginia shaking her head maybe.
I'm actually shaking my head. We accept the report as it is.
Okay,
How we use it
okay.
is this committee's choice. It ultimately is an appendix in the update that the selectmen will vote to send to the state, and they can do whatever they want with it.
Okay, I was just concerned because there's a clear call for inlet management in Four Ponds as being a
Right, but
pretty
that's,
probable solution, and I personally don't see that right now, and I didn't want it to seem as we were endorsing that as a course of action.
no.
That's all.
I don't see it.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Fine.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Nay. The ayes have it. Next item, discussion and vote on the statement of qualifications for Falmouth Aquaculture Nitrogen Reduction Pilot Program. This came to the committee at our last meeting. It was presented by Tom with the proviso that it was going to go back to the Shellfish Advisory Committee, and it is now back to us.
Mr. Chairman, just point of order, I believe Peter Chase, the chairman of the Shellfish Advisory Committee, was going to come at 4 o'clock.
Okay, You wanna wait
And
on this?
I would move to table this.
okay. We have a motion and a second
Second.
to table this until 4 o'clock. All in favor, signify by aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay, the ayes have it. Done. Next one. Recommendation on expenditure of state budget earmark. Julian will remember this one. An email appeared out of the blue from some state agency saying there's $25,000 here for the town of Falmouth. And we ascertained this was something Dylan Fernandez had put into the state budget back in July. And, well, it was in the House budget first, so, well, we'll give them both credit, but in any event, we've been tossing it around for a couple of meetings now, and we did send around to you a recommendation for the use of those funds, which could probably go up on the screen, but I can just read it. This is the result of multiple input from multiple members on sort of the fine points of how to spend $25,000. The idea is basically to sort of parallel the grant we got from the county, which allowed for a $7,500 grant to people who were willing to put IAs in the West Falmouth area. This would be for 3 more of those, only in watersheds of impacted estuaries, which have been identified in the MEP studies. Preference given to properties likely to be required to install IAs to meet the TMDLs. Preference given to watersheds where sewering is not the recommended options. An incentive grant of $7,500. Preference given to watersheds close to meeting the TMDL. Preference given to year-round households of 3 or more residents. Preference given to new construction currently in the permitting phase. And the systems must meet the criteria set forth in the municipal management plan. The funds would go to the Barnstable County Alternative Septic System Test Center, and they would administer the program. Can I have a motion?
No, I don't have a,
Well, I'll move
Thank you.
that we move forward on this, but that opens it to discussion,
Of
right?
course.
Yeah, good.
I'll second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion.
The numbering arrangement of the,
That's my fault entirely.
Oh.
I had a draft,
Okay.
and I thought I was gonna fix the draft, but before I fixed the draft, it got to Kristen, and then it got to you.
Oh, Kristen,
They were not really
you are no help at all.
So do you like option 2 or option 2?
Well, that's what I'm trying to decide. It's like a Chinese restaurant where I can't read the two different columns.
I'm gonna blame Kristen.
But, so we're ending up with 8 points, is that correct?
Well, I guess, yes.
Okay. And we're gonna award it as long as it's in West Falmouth from the looks of things.
High priority.
Yes, okay.
The reason they're a priority is they're this close to meeting the.
Yeah, well, I
TMDL.
know, I
And
just.
we get that,
just-
so there's a reason for that, but
I
it
was-
doesn't have to be West Falmouth if somebody elsewhere steps up to the plate.
Yeah, a couple comments. I have no problems with 3, 4, 5, and 7, but I've got questions about the others.
Well, At least one of the others was yours.
Well, that's, sort of, but it's not, first, 6 is the easiest one to deal with. Who cares if it's new or old?
I think the theory was, if someone is already in front of the Board of Health permitting their new system, it's a good time to say, why don't you put it in IA while you're at it, and we'll give you some money.
Well, let me say, my impression was construction there implied to the septic system, not to the structure.
Yes,
That's the implication, wasn't it, Eric?
absolutely.
Okay, so maybe rewrite that, slightly amend it right now for new construction of,
You move new construction of septic system.
I don't feel strongly about that one. I just didn't see the point of it. I mean, I have no objection if all of them were new construction, but if you found ones that met your other important criteria, like year-round and 3 or more residents, and the right watershed, and none of them were new construction, I wouldn't beat my head against the wall trying to look for new construction.
but the new construction's of the septic system, not of the house. Right? So
Well,
this
by
comes into play
definition,
when you.
whatever we put in will be something new.
Right, I think that's the implication. I don't think they mean a brand-new de novo system. If you're gonna take an existing system and upgrade it, it'd be applicable, right?
It's just preference. I don't want to waste
Yeah,
a lot of time on that.
preference, thank
Yeah.
you.
The one I feel more strongly about is the number 2, whichever number 2 you like here.
Yeah.
I had suggested the wording that preference be given to watersheds where sewering is not even a backup option. 'Cause
Well,
if-
and the answer to that is every estuary will have sewering as a backup option, because that's what DEP requires, so that's why I
Fair.
didn't use that language.
Fair enough, okay. But some are more likely than others to have that, or then in that case, we should at least address the issue of what happens if we, and we're only partially subsidizing, right? The homeowner is also doing something. So, but we're clearly encouraging them to put in an IA. If we then come along a few years later and say, guess what, we're gonna sewer your area. Do we grandfather them? I mean, you're gonna need to address this in marketing this to people anyway. I mean, otherwise I think it would be fraudulent of us to not mention that risk to the people.
You're basically expanding the grant program that's already happening right now,
Right.
right? So I don't see this as any different than what's already being done, and so for that reason, I have no problem with it.
Any other comments or questions? Ron?
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. I had sent an email to you in Virginia, staying with the open meeting law, basically just to a sub-quorum, about adding in the first item, number 2, of adding to eco-toilets. In other words, preference given to properties likely to be equipped or required to install IAs or eco-toilets to meet TMDLs.
I think the answer is this town has spent an enormous amount of time and money on the study of eco-toilets and this committee has concluded, with the possible exception of one member, that eco-toilets are not acceptable from the point of view of consumer acceptance. We offered many incentives, we offered all kinds of incentives, and we don't need to test them anymore about whether they work. This is to find out if an IA system can work in an efficient, long-term way. Those systems have been tested. They may well work as systems, but they don't work when you ask people to put them in their houses.
Well, we're not forcing anybody.
Well,
I
we're not
wouldn't say that.
subsidizing
We're not
people
forcing
to put
anyone,
them
it's
in.
just that if they wanted to do it,
Okay.
why
Is it-
not
is that a
have it
motion?
as part of this
Is that a motion?
program? It does the same thing, and George Hoyfelder has looked at them and shows them to be very
Do you
promising.
have a motion?
I have a motion to add that language.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, moved and seconded to add that language. Discussion?
It's irrelevant. Doesn't matter if it goes in there. It just makes the thing a little bit longer.
Right.
2 words.
I think adding it's inconsequential, and it leaves an option open that at least,
Except what, we don't want, we have no need to subsidize those
I know,
installations.
but what are the chances? As you said, we've tried for years to
All
get
right.
people to do them, and if we have
Okay.
another 3 upgrades available, what are the odds of somebody saying, oh, I want to grab one of those?
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Okay, all in favor of Ron's motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
No. Okay, the main motion, any further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Opposed.
Opposed?
2 opposed. Thank you.
Are you opposed?
No, are we accepting this as is?
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. We're down to reports of members and staff. Do we have any reports from the members and staff?
Well, I want to make a comment about what's coming next, because there was a lot of information today about the discharge options. The other piece of work that GHD has been working on is the conceptual sewer area, and that also needs to have a public presentation and rollout, and it will trigger some upgrades that are needed to the plant. That needs to be explained as well. So we've scheduled them for a March meeting. Yes, right, this is February. A March meeting, March 21st, I believe it is, to roll out that piece of the engineering work that they have been doing over the past year. The other area of work that GHD is currently under contract with is to help the town put together the update that is required to be submitted to the state by the end of the year. This is a fairly significant document. It will be presented to the selectmen probably in September, but the assembly of the chapters, there are, I believe, 14 chapters, the assembly of the chapters has already begun, and one of those chapters is a report to the state on the pilot projects, all the demonstration projects, the eco-toilets, the aquaculture, where we are in inlet widening, and so on. And so a lot of that work has now been done. Sia Karplus actually started it a year ago when she realized that she had a serious illness, and so she was so instrumental in the eco-toilet program in particular, and then starting the IA program in West Falmouth, that she wrote sections of, it's chapter 3. So we are nearly at the stage where that's ready for this committee to review. Ultimately, this committee will review every chapter and give input to GHD. So I am hoping at our next meeting, which is February 21st, that we will be able to send you that chapter, hopefully a week ahead of time. We have worked with Kristen and ScienceWares to set up I don't know whether I call it a website. Kristen, you have to tell me what the word is. But anyway, a point of contact at which we can all do edits. The edits can be seen by everybody else. And I think that that will help to facilitate us in terms of our editing, of starting with that chapter as our first effort. So I just wanted to sort of give you a heads up on that. It may mean that the next meeting would start at 2:30 as well, and so I wanted to make sure whether that was okay with the committee.
Matt, you're the one with the job.
Yeah, sure, 2:30 is fine, but, I don't know if it's possible for this particular chapter, but I think a week's time to review is not quite enough.
Is not quite enough.
Right, so
Okay,
I think we should strive towards getting the draft chapters out to the committee,
okay.
maybe, 3 weeks to a month before.
Really?
I really, yeah.
Whoa.
Okay.
All right, we'll try.
And so I'm obviously
Yes.
not possible for this time, but as
Yes.
you look ahead, I think it's fair to,
Sure.
to give ample time to
Right.
review
Good point.
such
Well, I
documents.
guess you can just say as soon as they're ready.
Yes, well, we'll,
But I know you're working to a deadline, right?
Yes.
So just set your
Right.
deadlines back.
okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, the committee and the town should know that Virginia and Kristen and GHD have been putting in a lot of hours for the last several months to get these chapters in the shape that they need to be in to be submitted to the committee and to the selectmen and to the state. This is, as you recall, a major undertaking from the last time, and they've been doing an awful lot of work on this.
This website editing thing is intriguing. I hope you've given sufficient thought to the governance of it. If you ask the people that run Wikipedia, they have wars.
Well, yes.
Who's facts?
And, right, so this is something of an experiment for all of us. Kristen, perhaps you would, it's with Google, and perhaps just give us a little explanation.
So what we worked out was by uploading into Google Docs, everybody can have access, so you can see everybody's comments simultaneously. It saves the it adds to back and forth discussion if there's a point that someone doesn't necessarily agree with, so that you guys can see everybody's thoughts simultaneously within there. Things that need discussion as a whole will be brought to light in that respect. It's a shorter turnaround time as opposed to me collecting all 7 versions and translating what your intentions were and then feeding that back. It's gonna be an easier platform, I think, all around. So I've set up a tutorial. Eric Turkington is going to try it, see how his tech skills are.
If I can figure it out, anybody can figure it out.
But, it's pretty straightforward. It's basically the same as what you would do in a Word document, but now everybody can put their 2 cents in. If you've got comments to make, because of the way it's set up, you just have to put your initials after it, so we know who it's coming from, unless you want them to be completely anonymous.
And we don't have to add special software to our computer.
Nope.
Thank God,
Yeah.
really.
We tried to make it pretty straightforward and pretty simple.
And we don't have to give Google all our life information.
Nope.
Good.
So, and I am perfectly available to help any of you that might need it.
One final point on the tertiary discharge issue. The town, in its capital projections, has allocated in the year 2024, $60 million for everything that will be associated with wastewater improvements, including plant upgrades, including discharge site, including sewering, collection system. $60 million doesn't go as far as it used to, as we're discovering, as we look at just the discharge site part of this conversation. And it's something to keep in mind. We will not, the town will not be able to do everything it imagined it wanted to.
Well, does that rule out the 2 outfalls?
Well, how's your arithmetic?
Well, I mean, if it does, it would save a lot of thinking, if there's some creative way around the fact that
Well,
60
Ron-
is less than 63.8.
Ron had a creative way, which is taking in other people's wastewater, but aside from
Not
that,
just-
it
yeah.
does rule it out, I think, with all due respect to the proponents.
Well, I think it's a brilliant idea. But the other thing, I just have a couple things. One is I would definitely support Matt. I mean, Virginia, you've worked on this thing for hours and hours and hours and are really familiar with these chapters, and the rest of us have to
Yes.
rush through them. So I think his point is really good.
I totally appreciate the input, you're right.
Yep.
You're right.
And I think, okay, and I have a staff report or a committee report.
Be making-
I sent this around to Eric and Virginia as well as to Amy and, not Amy, did I send it to you, Amy? No, I sent it to Chuck and to maybe Julian as well, sorry, but everyone's aware. I put in a warrant article for this coming summer. We developed a program of monitoring shellfish aquaculture activity in Bourne's Pond that was started 2 years ago, but the first year, for a few reasons, they didn't do the monitoring. And so the monitoring was started last summer, and we need to do 3 years in a row to satisfy DEP of the benefits of shellfish aquaculture with regard to water quality improvement and remediation. And so there's an article in to use certified free cash of $75,000, as we did last year, to do the second year, this year. And so the assumption is that, as far as I know, I've sent it to folks. I haven't gotten any feedback. I sent it to the financial committee as well, and the finance director. But just to make sure that you're all in the loop, that as Matt had raised last time about the aquaculture plan, there really isn't any monitoring. It's more of a production demonstration. But anyway, so this was sort of a carry-on from the start. And we were expecting a report, and I don't know what's
Actually,
happened to that yet.
We've contacted SMAS because they do owe us a report,
Right.
and we hope to have it fairly soon, right?
Well-
Next meeting.
It was supposed to be in January, and so as soon as I was aware of your article, I contacted Brian House. He's checking with his staff to see where in their queue this work is. So that's the best answer I have at this point. My memory was that the next year was a vote to fund the next year was contingent on the results from the first year. And so I made that point to Brian, just to remind him. The Finance Committee is going to want some concrete input. So, SMAS now knows, what the landscape is. And the ball is really in their court to produce some information that can substantiate this expenditure.
Well, in that regard, if they could give us at least an executive summary of their findings as soon as possible in the full report, that we can go over later, but at least to give us an idea about,
Yeah.
about how things.
I also mentioned that our next meeting was February 21st, just to, give him a deadline. It may mean nothing, but
Yeah.
I tried to, as much as I could, pressure him.
But also, Chuck Martinson said he took truckloads of oysters out of Bourne's Pond last summer.
Right.
And that it was like, he measured the highest production, I think, that had been accomplished anywhere, as far as I know, from that demonstration. So they're doing well there.
Right. At this point, the Finance Committee will not vote to approve unless there is some solid information to support it. And it may have to come back to the committee for an actual recommendation. I'm not exactly sure how they're going to handle it.
So, Ron, are you looking for our endorsement of your petition article?
No, this is just a report. It's
Yeah,
not an
y-
agenda
yeah,
to vote or
okay, I'm
something.
just-
Yeah, no, it would be something to, ultimately, if we get it on the agenda at the right time, it may be a town meeting that we would then make a presentation or whatever. I don't know how it's gonna work, but.
Yeah, I was just gonna,
Hopefully, we'll get the finance committee on board, in due course.
well, I just would suggest that we put it on the agenda for an upcoming meeting, so
Okay.
it's in the hopper and contingent on getting something back from Brian, we would have something to act on. But if we don't get it on the agenda, we're
We
kind of out of luck.
we can figure that.
Yeah.
Yep.
I have a question for the
Sure.
committee. So I was approached by a researcher who was interested or wondering if the town was interested in having denitrification being monitored in the location where these 3.5 acre sites would go in the Eel River.
Really?
Now, that's interesting.
And, well, they're looking for funding. So the question would be, if they were wanting to make a pitch, would they do that to the Shellfish Committee? Would they start with our committee? And it is a time-sensitive thing, because ideally you would do some baseline measurements in that area before you actually started the shellfish
I would
production. So-
suggest,
Takes a year before,
the-
though.
well, yeah, it would be kind of tough. They're hoping to have stuff in the water in June of seed, not, grow out stock, but seed. But I would suggest that we're more likely to be able to judge the merit of a proposed project than the Shellfish Committee would be, and maybe want it endorsed by both committees, but I would just suggest as a
Maybe
first,
start with your.
start with us, I think.
Well,
Us meaning this committee.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
discount.
That's what I think. I
Alright.
think they'd be,
But we can figure out who gets to think about it first. Does this person intend to put something in writing?
That's right, that's what they would do if the committee was open, hearing their,
Okay.
similar to proposals we've received for nitrogen,
Well, okay.
Cohasset River.
Yeah.
Gotcha. The chairman of the advisory, Shellfish Advisory should be here any
Should be
minute.
here.
Yeah,
Amy, would you mind
let's remind
opening
him
the
of that.
door and
Let's
leaving it
remind him.
open?
Yeah.
Let's hope he's not just waiting outside for some reason.
yeah.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, do you want to take a break until he gets here? Clearly, we're all waiting for him.
I
Well-
was
would
gonna
like to
suggest
stand
that.
up.
Okay, okay, 5-minute recess.
Okay. And then if he doesn't show
Okay, the Water Quality Management Committee comes back to order. We have Peter Chase here with us, the chairman of the town's Shellfish Advisory Committee. 2 weeks ago, we were all given a document called Request for Statements of Qualification, Falmouth Aquaculture Services. Tom explained what it was and went through the contents with us. I think we all nodded our heads, and if you could kind of tell us what's happened since then and where you want to go with this, that would be very helpful.
Sure. Well, the Shellfish Advisory Committee met, I don't have the date in front of me, but a couple of weeks ago, and approved the content of the statement of qualifications. And then at that point, it went to Peter Staub, and he showed it to town council, and so there are some issues there in terms of liability that they wanted to look at and sort out. And as a result of some of that, I think the dates got pushed a little bit. What our goal is to have the selectmen view it, hopefully approve it at the February, I think it's the 25th selectmen's meeting. But we think that would keep the project on track to have candidates selected by around April 1st and get gear in the water this spring.
Okay, can I have a motion? Whether
Move to approve it.
Okay, and a second?
I'll second.
Moved and seconded to approve the Statement of Qualifications for Falmouth Aquaculture Nitrogen Reduction Program, which on our document is called Statements of Qualifications Falmouth Mass Aquaculture Services. Okay, discussion. Tom? Oh, Ron?
Thanks, Eric. Hi, Peter. Good to see you. I've finally gone through this report in some detail, but not complete detail. I just had some outstanding questions I tried to try to resolve. And so the main purpose of this is really to open up aquaculture production in Seapit River, is it? Yeah.
These sites are in Eel River.
Eel River, sorry.
Eel River East.
Eel River, yeah.
But really, I'd say the primary driving force behind this is water quality.
Yes.
Okay, well, that I think is, that's good. I think it's, well, plus I think it's jobs, it's local food production, it's a lot of elements that could be added on, a lot of win-win-wins on this, maybe a few more than that. But, one thing was just the way it was designed. It didn't seem like the design was so much oriented toward this committee's and the town's interests for water quality improvement. And what I say there is that, and the thing that came up in my mind, the first question was that I knew that if you had so many shellfish per square foot that you couldn't do aquaculture in that area, in the bottom, right? And it's like 1 quahog per square foot, or 3 oysters, or 3 soft-shell clams. So that will limit expansion tremendously, because the way it's designed right now, because you just have static areas. In other words, there's one spot, someone gets a grant for a certain geographical plot. And therefore you can't, so to set up other ones, you have to find areas that are suitable with that criterion in particular met, in addition to the eelgrass setbacks and things. But so what I'm curious about is on this, the first question is why the earlier work the town did that was, I think, was fostered by CFS was to put forward this rotational aquaculture concept, where an individual would be given a grant for an area, and maybe the area is broken in 2 parts, at least. And in the first year, they'd be growing oysters in the one area. And then the town simultaneously would do its normal practice of seeding quahogs or other bivalves under it or in that area. So the production would be above the seeded area. And that seeded area would be closed to shellfishing, which is allowed in state law and also is practiced in town, not with aquaculture, but it's practiced as closed areas. Then the next year, a reserve area that was also under the grant would then be used, and they'd set up their floating gear in that area. And then the diggers and recreational fishers could then harvest in the previous year's area and take the clams, and then basically, and then they'd have access to them. The following year, with the Area B, they would be opened again to shell fishing, and then the producers may move, or the growers would move back to that area. That thereby opens up huge, tremendous potential for increased production and increased nitrogen mitigation. So it's not clear to me why, in a project like this, which to focus on water quality management, why we're not taking that step to do a pilot to see how this just might work. I don't understand. I spoke with Tom Shields, who's the South Shore Regional Supervisor at DMF Shellfish area, and also Chris Shalaki, who's yesterday, a couple days ago, went over some of these points. And they see, Chris especially has been involved here in Falmouth, and he was quite interested in our moving ahead with that, but it hasn't gone anywhere in this phase.
Ron, if there's a question, you might,
so my question
we
is,
can get an answer from
yeah, well, I
from
have
the
to
chairman
explain
here.
what I'm talking about to the listening audience out there, but it's sort of like, how come that wasn't put forward? To me, it's all right, it's a production scheme, but that's fine, but, which will help water quality.
Yeah, there have been some changes since this idea first came about with the rotational aquiculture. A lot of those changes, the Shellfish Advisory Committee was even formed. But I think part of the reason that the rotation became an issue is you don't always have good substrate for growing cohogs in areas where you want to be growing oysters. So you can't, the idea of floating bags and having cohogs in the bottom directly underneath, it's not going to work in every location. So I think it got a little bit too complicated, and for to push things forward, I believe, I don't want to speak for academic department of MES, because they might have had other reasons as well, but I know that was part of the issue back so this project that's proposed is really a pilot study just to see how well it works around sort of being control of contracting out the work, see if that's a viable model, and then expanding into other areas, and perhaps in other areas that would work. So that's my understanding.
Can I address that, Pete, and correct me, but my understanding from Chuck Martinson, the shellfish warden constable, was that DMF would not permit these operations where there was existing eelgrass or harvestable cohogs. Now, is that pretty close, Pete?
That's true, unless you have
Right.
a
So,
really unique deal with the DMF. If there are any wild shellfish down
Right.
there in any density, they're just going.
and where I'm headed with this is most of those areas receive potential baby cohogs every year, but they don't survive there because it's the black mayonnaise, the high sulfide, the black muck and stuff, which isn't going to sustain bottom-dwelling shellfish anyway. So our selling point largely has been we're taking over unproductive sections of bottom and growing shellfish above them, and therefore not taking away from what might be a viable commercial or recreational fishery. Does that make sense,
Yeah,
Pete?
I think that's true. I mean, if you have productive bottom for cohogs, there are going to be cohogs there, so you can't
Right.
grow oysters above it anyway. But if there's no cohogs there and you can grow oysters on top, well, then the cohogs aren't going to grow underneath. So that's why that system is a challenge.
Okay, well, okay, thanks. Just a few more things there, if I may. Well, it seems to me that if we're trying to really advance this concept as far as water quality management goes, that it could be that that's one option, but the others are that, Mr. Shalaki was very clear about saying that, yeah, come to us, this sounds interesting. And he'd been following it, and he didn't know, he wondered why it had stopped. He didn't know, because he was interested, the DMF guy was pushing the idea not pushing, but interested in receiving reviewing it. A couple other things are that came up because I was, I asked that question, and then it wasn't clear to me in item 5, under details of the aquaculture contractor's responsibilities. There's something about the town providing services. And there was no indication of like what that cost might be or how that might be worked out, for one thing. And secondly, this point did come up inadvertently with Mr. Shalaki, and he said that that kind of a relationship may not be legal. And that's something I think that needs to be checked. I don't know what else is in here that the DMF has seen. I mean, I think we need to get a statement on this plan from DMF before it really goes much further, because there might be other things that they can adjust. I mean, we have an experience from a couple years ago where the town put out a request for bids from producers. You may be one of them, who put out a bid to buy seed from the town. And you went to the trouble, and others went to the trouble to prepare this bid. And then in the end, it turned out the DMF said, no way, the town cannot sell seed to private growers, but could to municipalities. So they went to Orleans. So if this is another glitch, if people end up putting in proposals and doing the cost and the effort to do it, and then it turns out that, well, you can't do this thing, then it could be, in terms of regulations, then I think it needs to be checked.
Yeah, just to respond quickly, in that situation, that was much different because you're dealing with the town, in effect, selling oysters. This is, I'm not seeing the section that you're talking about, but I think
You can scroll to
in regards to
5.
renting of gear. So renting of equipment is much different than selling oysters. And this modeled very closely after the Orleans RFP that recently came out, where they did the exact same thing, and they contracted someone to grow using their bags.
Kristen's the
town's
top of
bags.
page 3.
Page 3.
Okay.
And so that indicates to me that the state is okay with it, but I also know that Chuck has been working, every step of the way with Mass Division of Marine. They know what's in here, and he's making sure that they're approving
Well,
the plan is.
Well, this, okay, Mr. Schlocke had not seen this, so it's just something you may want to check with him. It may need to be tweaked a bit, to be sure, just to be sure that we're not going to go down that same road where we hit a wall because of some technicality, if you like.
Can you get some others?
Yeah, so I would suggest that we get some feedback from them. The only other thing, and there are some wordings, there's some things in there that need to be tightened up in a few of the items, but has there been any consultation done with the abutters?
I don't know to date what has been done. I know that that's the plan to address that. So, in the next few weeks, I think.
Okay, because like with the Little Pond project, I was going to community meetings for 2 years before it went in, but it's important, and it went smoothly then. It's just more or less, you want to make sure everybody's on board. And, but I think that before really this thing being, somebody at DMF needs to send a note back saying, cool, this is fine.
On the abutter question, obviously on the Washburn Island side, there are no abutters. On the other side, On the Seacoast Shore side, there are abutters who tend to be seasonal residents who aren't here now. So whatever reaching out you're gonna have to do, may have to wait, or
Or
you
send
have to find
letters
some
or
way to get
something.
at them, other than waiting for them to show up at a meeting in February.
Yeah, I agree. And just to reiterate, these are things I will relay to Chuck, but this is the town going through the permitting process.
Right.
I'm here as a representative of the Shellfish Advisory Committee.
Right.
And what we did is provide input on this plan for Chuck.
Yep.
Environmental Services. So I will definitely pass along these concerns to him.
Yeah. The matter of abutters is on the radar screen. Chuck is on vacation this week, that's why he's not here today. But coordination with Webner has already begun, and they have looked at the abutters issue. They are more than 300 feet away, because they're on Seacoast Shore side, and they're beyond the distance that is regulatorily required if this were a Conservation Commission sort of hearing. But nonetheless, there is intent to have outreach to residents in the area. I think this is a work in progress, and I think the Shellfish Advisory Committee has really come up with some very constructive, creative efforts, and the town is trying to do its part to make it all mesh together. Frank Duffy is involved in this as well for the legal aspect. So I think you raise good points, but I do think that people are
Well,
aware of it.
It's just the experience, we can look at, you can scan it, of the Pompanesett.
Yep.
I forgot his name was York, it wasn't Rick
Yes,
York, it was
that's
somebody
right.
else who was also right across,
Right.
all the way on the other side,
Yep.
and it was gonna be underwater.
Yep.
Wasn't even gonna be floating. It wasn't gonna, but they just opposed it. So
You've got
I'm
a
just,
point.
it's,
I remember they put a
it's
budget,
something that really is important to get.
those
get
abutters,
past.
those
I'm
abutters
well
put a
aware of
budget amendment into the state
I know.
legislature.
I know, to declare it a sanctuary.
Right.
But Eric, the thing about that, it was caught.
Yes.
That's the amazing thing. How did it, who caught that, it was taken out, but
Really.
anyway.
All right, any other questions for the chairman here? Okay. Thank you for what you've been doing. We've talked about this as one of our top priorities as far as getting something in the water that'll improve the efficacy of this way of dealing with nitrogen. And you people picked up the ball and ran with it and are making it happen, and we're very appreciative. So with that, we've had a motion and a second, have we?
We have.
Okay, further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you.
Right.
Okay, any other reports of members and staff? Okay, prior minutes, January 17th. Everyone's had a chance to read them. Tom, do you have any improvements?
No, they're so perfect.
Whoa.
I move that they be accepted, subject to Tom's comment.
That sounds pro forma to me.
Right. I got a motion. Can we have a second?
I'll second that motion if I
All right.
may.
Move and second. Discussion? None.
Matt, can you move something for us?
Wait, let's get the
Wait, we
vote on
gotta
this.
take the vote.
Okay.
Oh, I thought we voted.
All in favor of accepting
Aye.
the minutes as presented, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? You guys have it. Okay. Matt?
You ready for your motion to adjourn?
I am.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Moved and seconded.
Okay,
Discussion?
unanimous.
All in favor, signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? You guys have it. Thank you all very much.